From the bench.
What, to give it an... Hold on 1 second. Go ahead, Megan. Tell me where we're going.
There are two types of...
Right. This is Robert Radcliffe. He's...
From the bench.
What, to give it an... Hold on 1 second. Go ahead, Megan. Tell me where we're going.
There are two types of...
Right. This is Robert Radcliffe. He's speaking in Tallahassee, Florida. He's the Leon County Commissioner. Let's listen to him.
And in 26 counties, punch cards are used. It's an obsolete technology. Experts have known for a long time that it's very unreliable, that the hanging chad problem is one of its most serious problems, and that it needs to be replaced. That's a little too late for our present situation. There are established and authoritative ways to correct this problem, which would involve counties identifying punch cards, ballots that have hanging chads on them, removing the chad, and running them through machines. Now, this is a procedure that's been codified by the state of Michigan, by the state of Kentucky. Various municipalities like the city and county of San Francisco and Whatcom County, Washington. So we're not talking about something that is unusual or speculative. It's a problem that has physical evidence. It provides certainty that the person who voted correctly. And it will allow those votes to be counted. Right now they're not, and that's why we have an inaccurate count for president. In fact, the problem with punch cards was so great that the chief elections officer of Massachusetts prohibited their use in 1998. Let me note that we also have, to begin with, that we have the statistical information that demonstrates that there is a problem with an accurate count for president. As you can see there, in counties that use optical scanning systems, there out of 1,000 votes cast, only 2, on average, did not record a vote for president. In counties with punch card ballots, it shows that number is 32. There, out of 1,000 votes, there were 32 votes that went unrecorded for president. Now, that's a very strong and compelling piece of evidence that there is a problem, and that problem is the hanging chad problem that we've identified. In these counties, we need to physically examine those ballots that we identify as not having voted for president, and determine which ones have that problem, correct the problem, run them through the machine again to get an accurate count for president. I brought with me some documentation for what I'm telling you. The Commonwealth Secretary, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, William Galvin, said 2 years ago that the punch card system has become inferior, and you can read it here, and that it needs to be replaced. And he describes in some detail the problem that you have with a stylus trying to punch out completely the rectangle of paper that's on the ballot. And that's part of your press package. The National Institute of Standards recommended eliminating punch card ballots in 1988. But that recommendation was never carried out by the Federal Elections Commission. They believed that it would infringe on the sovereignty of states. Here we have some other indications of the criticisms of that. Now, how do you solve that problem? In Whatcom County, Washington, there's established procedure. it says if there is a partial punch, count the vote if the voter's intent can be ascertained. If this is not possible, set the ballot aside and refer to the board. Hanging chad. If the chip or chad is connected by more than 2 corners, it shall not be counted. Otherwise, the chad has been shall be removed and the punch tabulated as if the chad had been no chad been present. So we're talking about a recount and an examination that already has established standards. The Commonwealth of Kentucky. If a chad is found attached to the card by 1 or 2 corners, the chad shall be removed by the election officer and the ballot card placed with the other ballot cards to be tabulated. The vote will not be counted when a chad is found attached to the card by 3 corners. State of Michigan. A ballot card with a hanging chad shall be processed by no less than 2 election inspectors of differing political parties, party preferences. A ballot card with a hanging chad shall be processed as follows. When a chad is found attached to the card by 1 or 2 corners, the chad shall be removed by the inspector and the ballot card placed with the other cards to be tabulated. Now this last chart shows the retabulation in counties using punch card voting systems that's already been done up to this point. In these cases, the ballots were run through the counters again, in which case, and this has been known by experts, some of the chads fall off. They're knocked off. They're so loose. Many more, however, continue to be attached and continue to register no vote. But as you can see, there are significant differences in the votes when they have been retabulated. So in short, I am asking for an examination of those ballots for which there was no presidential vote recorded, physical examination using the same established procedures as we have in the case of in Michigan and Kentucky to establish an accurate count. Now, what's at stake here is not just a person's right to vote, but a person's right to have that vote counted accurately. We don't know what the outcome of that will be. But what we do know is that if we don't do this, that this election will not be accurate and the results will be tragic in any event. In that case, I'll answer your questions at this point. Absolutely, all counties. And many of those are majority Republican counties, so you can guess what the outcome might be. This is something that should be a bipartisan effort. We all have, both parties have a commitment to free and fair elections. Let's go ahead and do it.
What do you think the totals you mentioned here in the statement? Like, do you have a feeling that what the outcome was before? There may have been more votes than
personally, I suspect it will show more votes for Gore, and that Gore will win the state of Florida. I don't know that for certain until those votes are counted. In fact, nobody knows that for sure until those votes are counted. There's something like 96,000 ballots in Florida for which there was no presidential vote cast. Until we do that, we will never know who won the state of Florida in this election.
And you see manual recounts as a way to kind of check up this chat thing, and that's the way to do that.
It is the established way to deal with this problem. It's not without precedent. It works in other states. It's something we need to do here.
What then is your reply to what was said this morning by Secretary of State Jim Baker when he talked about how we need to get this done, that he says, no need for a manual recount. Let's go with the recount numbers we've got and we're willing to drop the injunction. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that he ought to follow the statements of his boss, who said, I trust the people.
Sir, for those of us who were callously having lunch and got here a little late, could you sort of recap just the fun thing on the question?
Are there any other questions by? Yes.
This is the county commissioner in Leon County, which is in Tallahassee, Florida. And he's essentially making the case for this hand count, the manual count of the votes that he suggests might show, well, he doesn't know what it'll show, but he believes that Al Gore might win Florida if they go through a manual count. Nonetheless, well, what we're talking about here, and I'd like to give you a little idea, we're talking about chads, and what I did was punch a hole in a piece of paper. A chad would be the punched hole that comes out when you punch in for Al Gore, George W. Bush. The only problem, John Shubin says, is that what you're talking about here is a square and not a circle. But nonetheless, whatever comes out, if it's hanging on, this apparently has been a problem in Massachusetts, in Washington State, now in the state of Florida. What's wrong with voting this way?
It's not that there's anything wrong with voting this way.
It doesn't sound very accurate.
When you have very close races, this is an issue. And some people might see that as a problem, in that when you have close races, there may be 50 to 100 votes that cannot be accurately determined by a machine count.
All right. NBC's Chris Jansing is standing by in Tallahassee to bring us more on this. Chris, what do you know?
Well, absolutely, John. I've been following what you've been saying, and here you have a situation where we're looking at numbers that are more like a county commissioner's race or a local sheriff's race. So obviously the chads become much more important. They've been used pretty widely in Florida, according to the folks here who work for elections offices since the late 70s and early 80s. But some form of this technology has been around for at least 100 years. So we're looking at something that is not exactly high tech. Now, what's been going on here today? Obviously, there has been some major decisions made by the Bush campaign involving the decision to go ahead and fight in federal court the manual recount called for by the Democrats in 4 counties. Let's listen exactly to what James Baker, who is the head of the Bush recount effort, had to say.
The manual vote count sought by the Gore campaign would not be more accurate than an automated count. Indeed, it would be less fair and less accurate.
Now here we have been waiting for a response from the Gore campaign, and we haven't heard from them directly, but they did send out an email. It's very interesting, and I want to bring in NBC's Dan Abrams because he has been here throughout as well and has a little more legal expertise than I do. Here's what they're saying, that there has been a voluntary recount in Seminole County. There were 229 votes originally in favor of George W. Bush in that heavily Republican county. Now 98 more. Obviously, one of the things we could expect to hear from the Democrats in response to this lawsuit is, look, a recount could go either way.
See, what the Republicans would say is, we're not talking about the numbers, we're talking about the process. We're talking about the fact that the way that the counties have so much discretion here as to whether they do it, as to how they do it, simply makes it unconstitutional. It, in effect, dilutes other people's votes, and as a result, the Republicans are saying, we need to get the federal court to step in and say, hey, state of Florida, this statute violates the United States Constitution, and as a result, you just can't have it. And as a result, they're saying we want all of the recount requests to be nullified. Now, it'll be interesting to find out, assuming that this is true, of course, about these 98 votes on the recount, whether they viewed that as part of their recount, meaning their automatic recount that is kicks in based on Florida law. Their defense may be, look, we were doing a recount, we were recounting the votes, there was some irregularity, and as a result, we had to go through this process to figure out exactly what the number would be.
Dan Abrams,
we'll have to wait for the details. Yeah,
let me just interrupt you for a second, because John Shubin's been sitting here with me, and one of the things, number one, he says is that it's not unusual to have a hand count, first of all, when you have a close election. Then we heard from the Leon County Commissioner there in Tallahassee, who said, look, we have a very specific process. You have a Democrat and a Republican. Watch this go on. We're told what to do, how to do it, whether the Chad is hanging this way or that way depends depends on whether or not you count the vote. All those things. It sounds like there is some sort of process they go through.
It is some sort of process, and in addition, John, generally the people, the counting teams who are involved in the manual recount involve a Democrat and a Republican. So they do have some process in place, but that doesn't address the issue of the amount of discretion here. That's really what the Republicans are saying. They're saying, look, hey, you can tell me that there are basically these procedures that they have to follow, but in determining who makes the call about how far that Chad was falling out, they're saying, look, let's trust the machines who have no political affiliation.
So they're challenging the state law in Florida as it stands.
Oh, there's no question. They're trying to declare this particular part of the state law in Florida to be unconstitutional vis-a-vis the United States Constitution, saying that in effect these votes are being diluted and it violates the 14th and First Amendments of the U.S. Constitution.
And how unusual is it for the courts? Well, give me an idea just from a judicial standpoint here. How unusual is it for the courts to say that a state law, and this is not just in the state of Florida where they have these procedures with regard. These are used, as I understand it, John, maybe you can tell us, how many states use these sort of ballots?
I think maybe they're used in 20 to 30 different states, but I'm not sure. But there are standards that the supervisors of elections have for addressing this issue.
So what sort of difficulty does the Bush campaign coming in here and asking for this injunction on that basis, Dan?
Well, first of all, to get a federal court to step in and take away the state's right to make these sort of decisions, the county's right, is very unusual. I mean, generally, when you have a problem in an election law, with an election law, you'll step in and ask a state court. Here what they're saying is, we don't even really trust the state courts. We want the feds, the federal courts, to step in and to tell the state that this law simply is unconstitutional.
All right, Dan Abrams, Chris Jansing, John Shubin, we're all going to stand by here for just a second. We're going to take a quick break, continue our coverage of the Decision 2000. It's too close to call.
Mr.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm John Siegenthaler, and we're covering Decision 2000. This race is still too close to call. Let me bring you up to date on what we know right now. Basically, the Bush campaign has gone to federal court to seek an injunction to stop the hand counting of ballots in the state of Florida, in several counties in the state of Florida. There could be a hearing in federal court this afternoon on this case. Now, in the meantime, we're waiting. Let's go to Palm Beach County now, and they're making a statement right now on manual recount, on hand recounting the votes. Let's listen.
Tells us it is going to take several hours. So we have tried to schedule another briefing at a point where you will get some interim information on that count. Also in these rooms, the video of our government channel, TV 20, will be in here in the hand counting area. There will be video. Monitors are available. Many of you have already tapped into that feed. I hope if more of you want to do that, you'll get to the right officials.
Let me just let you understand why it is that the Palm Beach County officials are speaking right now. The manual recount is underway, despite the fact that the Bush campaign wants to stop it in federal court. So far, it is underway. So let's listen back into Palm Beach County for a moment.
When this is completed, the canvassing board will then have its opportunity to take a look at those results. One thing I should point out, and I'm maybe trying to anticipate some of your questions here, but one thing I want to point out to you is if one of the workers sees, could we try to keep down just a little bit so everybody can hear? If one of the counters should see a ballot that is dimpled, that means the stylus did not punch the Chad completely through. If they should find one of those and they can't really tell, it says, well, it looks like it might be, but we don't know, then that ballot is handed to the canvassing board. And that is where the final decision on the outcome of that particular ballot will be made by the canvassing board itself. And that, of course, is by law. In closing, and before we open it up to your questions, I want to reiterate, we know the gravity of this situation. We know what is facing and what the people of the country and the world are looking to this part of South Florida for an answer. And this supervisor of elections has told me, and her attorneys who are here with me can confirm that she is working and doing everything she can to make sure that this entire process is completed, that the complaints are dealt with, and that everything humanly possible is being done to make sure that this process is completed as quickly and as efficiently as possible. You know, you have to stop and think about the breadth of this thing and understand that there is no way in the world that the Supervisor of Elections office and her limited staff could even begin to anticipate this. And this is very, very big. There is a lot for her to deal with, and those employees that are working with her are feeling it too. These people are working hard, and they are working to get the job done.
We need the audio from inside the meeting to be on the script, to be on the monitors.
We will work on it. We'll get it to Channel 20 right now. They have been working on this, not just since all this began, but even before the election started on Tuesday. Count up the days, my friends. Some of them have been going on just a couple of hours sleep every night. So they're doing it, and they're doing the best they can. Now, we're going to continue to make sure that we get as much information to you as we possibly can, and we're going to ask your questions as best we can. And there'll be some that we can't answer, and let's go ahead and start that process.
Do we have the audio from inside the meeting, please, on the monitor?
We're working on it. They can hear you.
What happens if the hand count is different than the previous counts? What's the process after that?
Speak up just a little bit.
What happens if the hand count is different than the counts that have happened before? What is the process after that?
They'll be recorded. As far as the difference is concerned, that's why, of course, it's being recounted to see if there is. They'll be recorded.
Say what's going to happen. What happens next?
I can't answer that for you right now, but we'll get it for you.
If there's any question in your mind about the difficulty that the election officials, county by county, in the state of Florida are going through right now, just take a look at the officials in Palm Beach County. The pressure is on, the tension is on, the stakes could not be higher. We're talking about the President of the United States. Now, let's go to Austin, Texas. This is a tape that we're getting ready to see from Austin, Texas, of Governor George W. Bush and his running mate, Dick Cheney. They've been actually on his farm is a ranch in Crawford, Texas. That's where they've been meeting today. And that's Andy Card on the right. Now, if in just a moment we're going to hear the governor speak, he's got a few comments to make today, but you should know that while this tape was being made, the Bush campaign, led by James Baker, is seeking an injunction to stop that manual recount that is already underway in Palm Beach County, as we heard from Palm Beach County officials just a moment ago. So they're heading to the microphone. They continue their discussion about a transition if George W. Bush does become the President of the United States. Let's listen to what they have to say.
Semi-name. Pleased to welcome the Cheneys and Andy Card here, and we're just going to continue our discussions about the future. And as I said yesterday, I think it's responsible that Dick and I and others contemplate a potential administration. And so they've come, and we're going to spend the day here today. And First Lady Bush will be arriving here soon. It's nice to be out here in the country. Last night it was such a wonderful feeling when we arrived at Crawford at about 9:50 at night. Hey, please, it's not your turn. Sorry, the dogs wanted to have a few comments. What she says was, let's finish the recount. Anyway, arrived. Hey, Spotty, Gordon. Yes, sir. Somebody needs to take care of the dog. Thank you, Gordon. Just go ahead and throw the ball. Anyway, we arrived at Crawford. I arrived at Crawford with Andy, and about 70 of the townspeople were out there, just so sweet and nice and kind, and just made me feel great to be here. They were just, I don't know if they still got the decorations on the gate or on the trees, but some of the town people decorated the highway in. It was a wonderful feeling to be amongst friends. You got something to say?
Yeah, Lynn and I came down to Austin planning to spend one night in the hotel and then going up to Washington Wednesday, and we've sort of moved in now to the hotel there in Austin for the duration. It's nice to get up here for the weekend. Kind of the governor and Laura to invite us to come spend some time here on the ranch, and we're not in a position clearly to be able to begin the transition at this point until the situation in Florida is resolved, but we can do some planning. We didn't have much time during the campaign to do a lot of transition planning, although some work was done by Clay Johnson.
Right.
And but this is really the first opportunity this week we've had to sit down and spend much time thinking about putting administration together. So we are doing some of that preliminary planning this week, and with Andy and the governor and myself.
Governor, why did you decide to go forward and seek the injunction in Florida?
I think you ought to call Jim Baker, let him. He made the explanation today, and I thought it was a very sound and reasoned explanation. And if you got any further questions about that, just call him. Call his office. He'll be the person in charge of explaining our position as to why we don't think there needs to be 3 elections.
On another front, you clearly are making some move towards transition, which you hope will happen. What have you told your state staff about planning for a session? Have you told them to keep going forward?
Yeah, I have. I mean, everybody's keeping their powder dry. It's just an interesting period, Ken, where we're all in limbo, and that there are some responsible. Keep using the word responsible because I think the people of America understand there's a very good chance that Dick and I will be the president and vice president, and we need to be, when that happens, we need to be prepared. This is an awesome responsibility, and so we're planning. I've told the state staff to, be steady, and.
Are they doing the preparations as if you might be there also? Do you have dual track?
Well, we have been, as you know, it's one of the stories you wrote earlier this year. Congratulations for ferreting this out. I hope it keeps you in good standing with your newspaper there, but it's nothing's changed since you wrote your story.
Surely something has changed.
No, well, we've had an election. We've had an election and we've had one count, then we had another count, and fortunately we won both counts so far. But
how stressful has this been for you?
I feel fine. I really do.
Sleeping okay?
Very soundly, thank you. And I know we've got the best people on the ground in Florida. James A. Baker, and people looking after our interests, and I feel great. It's nice to be in the same bed 2 nights in a row.
I know you mentioned the question should be referred to Mr. Baker, but
that's right.
Do you feel that
I feel you ought to speak to Mr. Baker. He made a very strong statement this morning. It explains the rationale for our decision. And if you've got any further questions, I really wish you'd refer to him.
What governor? Yes,
Susan.
Sir. Regarding this injunction, is this a way of saying enough is enough?
Well, I think our attitude is that there are still absentee ballots to be counted. And this election will be determined after those absentee ballots have been counted. We've counted once, and we recounted in Florida, or that everybody recounted. And we fully recognize there are some ballots outstanding from overseas, and the people ought to be included in the process. And it seems like to us that once those ballots are counted, we'll be able to determine who the president will be.
do you anticipate any action in states where you lost narrowly, like in Wisconsin or Iowa?
You mean the new state looks like we may have won, which is New Mexico. We're very pleased that even though the election results were called by people on election night, they've counted and waited for all the ballots to come in, and it looks like we may have a narrow lead in New Mexico. No, all options are open, of course. But what will be good for the country is to have this election over with so that the new administration can do the people's business. And
Governor, what do you say to those who criticize you today for ceding the high ground to the Gore campaign by being the person who filed?
Well, there's 8 lawsuits filed already prior to us. And as Jim Baker said, if we'd be willing to withdraw that lawsuit depending upon Vice President Gore's campaign's decisions. And we've had one election, then we recounted the election. Unfortunately, we came out on top both times, and it's and so the Secretary made a very strong statement, and I would refer all questions about that statement to him in his office.
Last question.
Given that this election,
Spotty, please.
would you consider appointing Democrats to your cabinet?
You know, I think it's very important for us to get this election behind us, and I would hope someday that I will be answering that question after this election is final. My infection? Well, I'm sure glad you asked. What infection? Oh, that one. I was hoping nobody would notice this Band-Aid here. Well, it's good to see you, Susan. It's fine. It got pretty severely infected, and I had a doc look at it, and I'm taking antibiotics and putting on hot compresses, and it's beginning to retreat, thankfully.
Governor, you were supposed to seek a mandate from the people, not a Band-Aid.
Very good, Herman. Thank you all for coming. Patsy, the last time you were here was a little... Did you see it? Yeah, where'd you see it?
Amongst the cows.
Fabulous. Did you all see this? Did you record the stag?
Yeah,
It's a magnificent animal. Yeah. Oops. Sorry to Spot the dog felt like she had to add something, but she's, you know, I think she's as anxious as most Americans to find out. Thank you all for coming out. We'd like to feed you, but we don't.
And the governor's dog's getting a little national attention down in Crawford, Texas, as he makes his statement to the news media about this very, very close election. Of course, you heard several times the governor say we've had one count, we've had another count, we still have the absentee ballots, but when the absentee ballots are in, he believes he will be the next president of the United States, and he believes this should be over. And that's why the Bush campaign is seeking an injunction today to stop another count, a third count, what they call a manual count of the votes in several counties in the state of Florida. In the meantime, I want to go to Ashley Banfield, who's in Crawford, Texas, to give us an idea, Ashley, what we understand Governor Bush is going to be doing in the next couple of days.
Well, I can tell you this, John. He showed up last night fairly late in the evening, and as he said, he was greeted by a lot of well-wishers here in Crawford. We do know a little bit more about his schedule at this point, although it's not a completed schedule. The schedule for now is that he's planning to go back to Austin tomorrow night, possibly the next day, Monday. At this time, Dick Cheney arrived today. He's only had a chance to sort of get a formal or an informal tour around the ranch, and then that photo op and that press pool interview that you just ran. So there have been no formal meetings at this point, but as we both know, and our viewers know from the video that we've shown earlier, Andrew Carr did show up with them last night. Whether they had some informal talks, we don't know that, but it can only be assumed with a 2.5-hour drive north of Austin, they had to be talking about something. And you heard the governor himself say that it's a responsible thing, he says, to contemplate a future administration. And then you also heard him making jokes in the next vein about Spotty the dog barking and taking some of the attention away from him. But we do want to tell you, John, also that this is supposed to be a little R&R. He said it's nice to sleep in the same bed twice, 2 nights in a row. Yeah, I totally understand.
You understand that, don't you? Well,
yeah,
you know, the other
thing... been on the campaign trail 3 weeks.
The other thing we saw is the Band-Aid that he had on his face that appeared yesterday, that, and he says there's an infection, but apparently he's doing okay with that. A lot of stress when you're on a campaign and when you don't know whether or not you've been elected the President of the United States.
Yeah, and look up behind me. This is like, I guess you could say, the stress-free central. This is FM 185 and 317 in the middle of almost Nowheresville. It's just a great little town, Crawford, Texas. About 10 miles away from Waco. 10 miles from Waco, we drove here this morning, and we were some of the first people here, and the folks at the coffee station. I mean, this is downtown, the coffee station and this gas station, and they said it's great to have them in town here. Some of the townsfolk came out for lunch today and said it was just such an exciting thing for them. So this is something that he feels is a quiet place for repose, but I think there's a lot of quiet time for contemplation of serious business as well, and clearly that's what he wants to do. But he did leave most of the staffers behind in Austin. We do want to let you know that a lot of the folks who've been working very hard on this campaign for the last several years are still in Austin, toiling away.
On pins and needles. All right, Ashley Banfield, thanks very much. We go from Bush to Gore in Washington, D.C. That's where the Vice President is, at the Vice President's residence, and NBC's Diane Diamond is there as well. And Diane, let's talk for a moment about what we might hear this afternoon from William Daley, the head of the Gore campaign, about this injunction that's been filed by Governor Bush's campaign to stop the manual recount.
Well, in a word, you're going to hear a lot of criticism. That's what you're going to hear. NBC News has talked to some top media officials with the Gore campaign who are not in this town, but they're in the know. And they seem to give us the feeling that what you'll hear Daley and Warren Christopher say mostly is they'll talk about the hypocrisy of the entire situation. George W. Bush's camp, of course, came out and sort of pointed the finger and said, look at Al Gore. He's about to file a legal challenge to all this stuff going on down in Florida, and that would only prolong the situation. Of course, this morning we wake up and we are told George W. Bush is filing for a court injunction. So, in fact, it was Bush and not Gore who actually took this step. However, we should say that there are at least 8 other lawsuits already filed on those Florida returns, and the Gore camp has endorsed those. They have not joined with them, so they technically haven't really filed any lawsuits. That's what we think that they've been talking about in here. William Daley, Warren Christopher, all of a sudden showed up here today. The media figured that they were still down in Florida, honchoing that whole situation there, but at about 11:05 Eastern time, they showed up at the front gate here. They were allowed in. That was 3 hours ago. What they're talking about, we don't know, but we were told that there would be a pool camera to take some pictures of it. The pool camera never got inside the gates, we now find out. We set up down here for a news conference, and within the last hour we were told there won't be a news conference here, but get ready, pack up. Sometime later today, if we have a news conference, we'll give you 45 minutes warning, and several of you can go up the big hill. So that's what we've done here. It's a mass of wires and confusion, but people are getting ready in case there is a news conference. We're told there is going to be one, and it'll be Warren Christopher and Daley, but no Al Gore.
And we should add that we understand that the Gore campaign is going to fight this in federal court, and that may be one of the things they say at this news conference, if there is a news conference later on today. All right, Diane, thanks very much. We'll get back to you in just a little while.
You bet.
Let me try to set this stage one more time. Today we went into this with the George W. Bush still leading Al Gore by a very small number of votes in the state of Florida. There has been one recount, and then another recount, and now, there's been one count, there's been the recount, and now a hand count going on in several counties, including Palm Beach County, where there have been questions about the vote and how people were able to vote there. So today, the Bush campaign decided to seek an injunction in federal court to try to stop the hand counts. As you heard Governor Bush maybe say just a little while ago, after the recount and after the absentee ballots are in, they believe this should be over. NBC's Chris Jansing is standing by at a central location, Tallahassee, Florida, actually, where a lot of information has been flowing, and maybe you can bring us up to date, Chris.
Well, this is what you've been talking about. It's about the size of a novella, John. This is what was filed today in the Southern District Court of Florida by the Bush campaign, saying basically, stop this hand recount. Now, James Baker, who is the head of the recount team here for George W. Bush, said, look, we prefer that they just step aside. As you said, John, accept the results of this election, as we will, understanding that next Friday there will be the overseas ballots yet to be counted. But they say, look, this should be the end of it. We should not be going into count after count after count, and it's all laid out here in these 49 pages. Kenneth Sakaya is a former U.S. attorney. He was appointed by the Bush administration. He has been working in recent years with Jeb Bush, the brother of the candidate, and joins us to talk about the Republican position. Thanks very much for being with us.
You're very welcome.
Give us the gist of what is at the heart of these 49 pages.
Okay, what we did this morning was we filed an action to preserve the integrity and the finality, more importantly, of this election. We've had a count. We've had a recount. Now we're asked to have a third count. And the concern that we have is that the continual recounting and recounting and recounting doesn't necessarily produce the most accurate result, only the most recent result.
And yet we have talked to any number of experts on both sides of the political spectrum, people who consider themselves to be non-political, and they all say this is the system that's in place. And particularly when you're talking about these punch ballots, which are known to have raised questions over the years exactly of this nature, but not of this import. And in fact, in these cases, a manual recount is in fact more accurate.
Well, let me say this, Chris. I have spent some time in one of these counties where the canvassing board determined at the time of the election not to count these rejected ballots. That's a determination they're called upon to make at that time. And if they are allowed, under the scrutiny of a very close election, to go back in and begin this process of ascertaining intent. For instance, let's say that one of those little holes is punched partially, but it wasn't punched all the way through. They're going to make the assessment, I suppose, that it was the intent of the voter that they punch all the way through. But it might have been the intent of that voter that they not vote for any candidate in the presidential election. And there are many ballots which are cast that way. So I can tell you that based on my experience in this particular election in a rural county here in North Florida, in Gadsden County specifically, I looked at ballots which had previously been rejected and not counted, which the canvassing board in that county decided to open up and to look at. And they're looking at those ballots to assess voter intent. So that they will say...
But isn't that the way the process works? Isn't that the way that it is provided for in state law? The state law gives people who feel that they haven't had their chance to be heard in the voting booth to go back and seek redress, and that's what's happening, for example, in the 8 lawsuits. That's what's happening with this recount.
Well, I can tell you that that is not what has happened in response to the Secretary's request for a recount. The Secretary wanted a recount of the ballots. That is the Secretary of State. And in counties where I have been, they have not done simply a recount. They have reopened those ballots which were previously rejected. The question has to be asked, why didn't they do that on the night of the election? They didn't do that because the machines were calibrated to reject ballots which were inappropriately marked. And we object to this, continually going back to the process. And what I think we have to ask ourselves is, to what extent are we going to open up a Pandora's box here?
One of the people that we talked to is the General Counsel for the Supervisor of Elections. He represents the Commission supervisors in all 67 counties. Ron Lebaski, you know him. Let's hear what he had to say about this whole controversy over whether hand counting is indeed more accurate.
It's ludicrous for him to say that. The fact is that there are established procedures in other states for counting ballots that have been spoiled by technical problems. We should be, if we're going to have an accurate count, it is something that is necessary to do. If we don't do this, we will never know who really won the state.
We will never know who really won the state. What's your response?
Well, I want to say I couldn't hear what he was saying there, but I can assume that he was probably saying, I actually don't know what he said.
His argument is basically this. This is the last, because I talked to him for a long time today, this is sort of the last check on everything, that we can really look at these. For example, I'll tell you what the Democrats will say. If someone knows that they made a mistake and they wrote in George W. Bush or Al Gore, you can't tell that by running it through a machine. You can only do that if you go back and have a count. And when it's this important, when the future of the presidency weighs on the line, shouldn't we go through every possible course to make sure that we have the most accurate count possible?
Well, Chris, what I would say to that is, then why? And we might then ask ourselves, when can we stop? When does the process end? In other words, we could go back to other elections and say, well, you know, it could be that if we did another recount, we may end up with a different result in other states as well. But at some point, the candidates have to accept the cards they were dealt. And in this situation, you have it's almost as if you're saying that let's do my own accounting of my checking account at home and send it to the bank and say, I want you to go by this. I want you to go by the manual recount, because in my view, the manual recount is much, much less valid than the machine recount. Because in that situation, you have the machines previously calibrated. The machine is neither a Democrat nor a Republican. The machine is going to determine, based on what is previously calibrated, which of those ballots are valid. And if you are in a voting booth and you don't properly cast your ballot, and you end up voting for two different persons, then that ballot should not be accepted. And I might note that in the last election, my understanding is some 15,000 ballots from that same county, Palm Beach County, were not counted.
Ken Sakai, we have to let that be the last word, but thanks very much. Here speaking on behalf of the Bush campaign. And John, who would have thought only a few days ago when we went into the voting booth that on the following Saturday we would all become something of election experts and talking about chads and talking about paper ballots versus electronic ballots. And
you know, I didn't know about chads.
I didn't even know what one was.
I have to be honest with you, and I've yet to see a chad, although I've tried to make a representation of a chad here on MSNBC. But before long...
Can I tell you a quick story, John?
Yes.
There was an election expert who was in here, and he said that when he took his first case in election law, he kept getting these calls about chads, and for the longest time he thought it was a person, and he was so confused, and so he said, I can't imagine what the American people are thinking.
I'm sure they are, but before long they're going to know, and we're all going to know exactly what a chad is and exactly what it looks like and why it could affect this presidential race. Chris Chansing, thanks very much. We're going to talk to you in a little while. As we said, the Bush campaign is seeking an injunction. Chris had it in her hand right there to stop the manual count, which is going on in several counties in Florida. We'll get back. We'll talk more about this. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Yes, it is still Decision 2000, the battle for the White House, and it's too close to call. And there is a controversy. There are many controversies going on in the state of Florida right now. But let me bring you up to date on one that we do know about. Earlier today, we heard that there was a ballot box in Miami that had been picked up by the Miami Police Department and was sitting in an evidence room at the Miami Police Department. We have more information on that now. Apparently, it is not a ballot box at all. It's a supply box. So that mystery has been thrown out. No problem there. No votes that haven't been counted. No need to worry. In the meantime, there are places in Florida where they're still trying to count the vote, and one of them is in Palm Beach County, where they're continuing a manual recount. NBC's Suzanne Malveaux is there to bring us up to date on what's happening. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, John. Things are changing minute by minute, and it's amazing the focus of the country on two rooms. We're calling one of them the machine room. That's where they're recounting 462,000 of Palm Beach County's votes of their ballots. This is the other room here where you see all of the cameras pressed up against the glass. This is where the hand count is going on, and this just started a couple of minutes ago. What you see inside of that room, you have counters who are sitting at those tables, those long tables. They are made up of 10 Republicans, 8 Democrats, and 5 nonpartisan members. They are staffers of Teresa Lepore. She is the supervisor of elections here for this county. That group consists of various numbers of people. You can see most of them actually are women. We asked about that, and they said that most of her staffers are women, but these are people from the county clerk's office who have been recruited to do this task. Now, of course, the controversy is whether or not this is a fair process because it is a hand count. Well, you'll notice the people who are actually standing up there, they are what's called the observers. Those are representatives from the Democratic as well as Republican parties who were brought here to make sure that this is a fair process. What they are doing, and I'll tell you, they are taking this job very seriously. We saw when they first brought in these ballots, they were locked in steel boxes, dozens of them, brought over in a security van from Delray Beach, and were walked over to the machine room and then further brought over by security personnel to this room behind me. But what they are doing is taking a look at these ballots and seeing if there are any irregularities. They're looking for scratch marks, for pen marks, for handwritten notes or indications of which candidate they may have chosen but didn't punch correctly.
Suzanne, can I stop you right there? Let me ask you, first of all, we're talking about all of the ballots that were cast in Palm Beach County, or just the, what, 19,000 that have been thrown out?
Okay, what you're seeing behind me in this room just represents, it's 4,300 ballots. And those ballots represent 1% of the voters for Palm Beach County, or 4 precincts. In the other room, the machine room, is where they are doing a total recount of all of the county's ballots. So when it's all said and done, they'll have a third recount of the county's total number of ballots, but they will also have taken a look, hand counted only 1% of those votes.
Why is that?
If there are any irregularities within those 4 precincts, so that 1%, then they will go ahead and look at the figures and compare them. Now, the reason why that the Democrats want this particular group is because these are the precincts where, first of all, there was an unusually high number of undervotes, or those people who cast their ballots but didn't actually check off or punch something. The machine didn't pick it up. They want to make sure that those votes are intentionally either they didn't make a decision, or there was perhaps a decision they didn't catch. They want to catch it the second time. And secondly, these are primarily Democratic precincts. It would be in their best interest to capture those votes if there were votes that didn't go through.
So when they get this, and when do they expect for this to be through?
It's going to be a long day and a long night. John, we are told that this is probably going to last until midnight, because you'll remember the last time when they did the machine count. It took all day.
All right, and so when they get the results, what do they do with them?
After they get the results, the county actually has to certify. It goes to the canvassing board. It has to be certified by the canvassing board. Now, there is a little bit of a glitch here, because a judge has asked that the certification process is not completed until their court hearings that take place on Tuesday. Friday is when we actually expect to get the absentee ballots at that point, and that may or may not really upset the election. So we're looking at another week of this kind of counting process, this procedure, to all sort this out and figure out where we go from there.
All right, Suzanne Malveaux, thanks very much. If we can, I'd like to keep that picture up of them counting the votes while I talk to John Chauvin about this election and what's going on in Palm Beach County. John's an expert on elections in Florida. So, John, tell me, I thought that when we talked about a recount, we were talking about hand counting all the votes in Palm Beach County, but that's not what's going on, is it?
You know what? Under Florida law, if a manual recount is accepted, it's 1% or 4 precincts. So it's not the entire amount, but the canvassing commission does have the ability to authorize a recount, a manual recount of all the ballots.
So the precincts we're looking at here, I have the list in my hand, 4 precincts. It's the Sugar Sand Community Center, Fire Station number 42 in Delray Beach, Florida, the Veranda Club in Boca Raton, the Palm Beach Gardens First Baptist Church. Now, that doesn't mean anything to those of you who don't live in Florida, but what does it mean when they select these particular areas? They're older, I would assume, more Democratic or not?
I would assume that the person who requested those precincts believes that that's where the highest percentage of votes for their candidate lies. So I believe that those are precincts that are probably very strong Gore precincts.
So when you get the percentages back, what will they show?
If there's a deviation, the canvassing commission can then make a number of decisions, and presumably the Gore lawyers will request for a manual recount
for the whole
all the
county.
Precincts.
I
Yes.
see. And that could take how long?
It could take a long, long time.
Weeks and weeks?
Probably 3 to 4 days.
Oh, so 3 to 4 days.
Probably by the end of by Friday.
I looked at those people in that room and where do those people come from? I mean, you know, when you're determining the President of the United States, everything is suspicious here. Where do they find the people that make the decisions that then turn that information over to the county?
They typically work for the supervisor of elections. They're long-time county employees.
Democrats, Republicans, just depends.
Typical civil servants. And what they do is they do identify themselves so that when they break up into teams, they have a Democrat and a Republican counting together.
And that's supposed to make it fair?
That's supposed to make it fair.
Okay, so what could happen here is they could go through these 4 precincts, and they could come out, and the Gore campaign could say, look, these numbers show that we ought to have a count throughout Palm Beach County.
Absolutely.
And then that could take another 3 or 4 days before we know the results of that. Now, again, back to you, because we heard some of this earlier. How unusual is it for a hand count? Is it part of the regular procedure in Florida? Is it part of state law? Are the instructions about how to do it mandated?
It's not part of the regular procedure, but it is part of state law if it's requested, and it's often requested in close elections.
And there are detailed instructions on how you go about it?
Yes. The question, though, is to what extent are there standards to determine when you accept a ballot and when you don't accept a ballot?
And are there?
There are supervisors of election standards. Florida law does not specify, based on my understanding, the specific standards, for example, counting a Chad.
Now, as I understand it, the Bush campaign is challenging the constitutionality of this state law. Has anybody ever done that you know of?
I'm not aware of it.
In Florida?
I am not aware of it. I haven't seen the lawsuit, but based on what I've heard, it's on the basis that there are no standards upon which these people can say, let's accept this vote as opposed to not accept
But don't election officials do that all the time or not?
They do it all the time. And for example, in the case of absentee ballots, they will compare signatures. They have a lot of discretion.
All right. John Shubin, who is very knowledgeable on the situation in Florida, has been trying to help us navigate this complicated situation. And we will continue to watch those people in Palm Beach County and the other counties where they are hand counting some of the votes as we continue our coverage of Decision 2000. It's still too close to call. We still don't know who the next president will be, but we'll stay with it until we do. Situation in Florida. You go through and you punch out a hole. This is where you'd punch out one of those holes. And this is the Chad right here. And, all right, so when they punch it, does it not always fall out, John? Is that it?
It does not always punch out. It depends on how hard someone punches it.
Can you see whether or not it's punched out when you've done your ballot or not?
You can't always. And people remember in a hurry. Some people punch it quickly, they move on, and they have no way of knowing whether it was completely perforated through.
Okay, and so if you punch too hard, then it goes through. If you don't punch hard enough, it doesn't go through. It can be attached by, I guess, at the top. I'm having trouble getting this here, but it can attach at the top and also the bottom, or the corners. Is that it?
I believe it can attach on all four sides.
On all four sides. And that's what we're saying. If it's hanging by one thread, then does it count? If it hangs by two threads, does it count?
Well, that's up for the canvassing commission to decide, but that's based on my experience. If it's completely hanging and it's clear that somebody tried to punch it, it just didn't punch out, those are the sort of votes that are accepted.
So what if it has two of them that are punched out?
It's up for the individual canvassing commissions to decide.
Well, how can you know whether the intent was to vote for a Democrat or a Republican based on what you see with the Chad?
Well, in this case, for example, assuming someone's looking at it, you can see there was no attempt to punch the Republican.
This is the Republican right here.
And that somebody, it looks like, attempted to punch the Democratic. Now, I can also say that sometimes these things just get loose with a lot of handling.
And that happens the more you deal with these ballots.
That's an interesting phenomenon. Even the more times that you do a regular recount, we're feeding them through the machine, things can get looser and looser.
And that means that you really might not have a true picture of how people voted.
Or you may have a true picture if someone attempted to punch it through and it's just getting looser and it's becoming visible to the eye. It's hard to say.
All right, John Shubin, stand by. We're going to continue this discussion about Chads and the election when we come back right after this.
USA
to rule on that injunction, or at least to have a hearing on that injunction. The two Florida counties that have agreed to do a hand count will do so unless the judge tells them to stop. Now, Florida isn't the only state that we're watching today. There are other states that have problems as well. NBC's Nora O'Donnell is here to bring us, to tell you the honest to goodness truth, I don't know what you're here to bring us, so that's a good thing, all right?
We're going to talk about a lot of things.
Okay, good.
First, I'm going to tell you, the Gore campaign has now officially reacted to Secretary Baker's comments, saying, Chris Lehane saying, quote, "We are confident that Americans will reject Mr. Bush's arrogant stance and will demand a full, fair, and accurate counting of Florida's votes." Now, there are additional sources who tell me that when we hear, that we are expecting to hear from the Gore campaign today, that they will defend the rights of Floridians to continue this recount. In other words, since Secretary Baker has come out today seeking an injunction, that the Gore campaign will argue the other side. There has been a judge assigned to this suit. That judge, we've learned, is U.S. District Judge Donald Middlebrooks, who is a Clinton appointee and works out of Miami-Dade, who's said to be very well respected. A clerk in his office tells that they have not yet decided on whether they will hear that suit today. Why is this important? Because as those pictures we've seen all day today, the recount is going on anyway by hand, and that could significantly change this. So we're waiting to hear more about this injunction, whether this judge will in fact hear it today, and as expected that the Gore campaign will present arguments on the other side. What's interesting is we were expected to hear from Secretary Christopher and Secretary Daley, who are at the Vice President's house, we had initially heard at about 12 o'clock.
Right.
It's now been 2.5 hours.
Yeah, and we are told that it could be that they won't make a statement later on today as well. I mean, it's been back and forth all today. Let me go back if I can. The lawsuit, the injunction, they've asked for an injunction from a federal court judge because they believe, the Bush campaign believes, that the Florida law is unconstitutional when it comes to hand recount because there are no standards, right?
Right, but there are several legal experts that I've spoken to today who believe that that's a very tough burden to prove, that there isn't much precedent for that it would be difficult for the Bush campaign to make that argument. And they're also seeking some relief in other ways. They're also seeking in that injunction that someone declare, for instance, that that butterfly ballot is valid. So they're seeking several legal remedies in that case, which might be difficult to receive. The feeling inside that I'm getting from people within the Gore campaign, people within the Democratic Party as well, is that they feel emboldened now. They believe that the Bush campaign has made a wrong step. In particular, they say that he, after criticizing some of the other 8 lawsuits that have been filed by other people, that he then has taken the step on behalf of the Bush campaign and filed a lawsuit on his own. They think, politically speaking, he has made a bad move, and that they feel somewhat energized by this. I might also add, they've not only moved their war rooms from Nashville, Tennessee to Tallahassee, Florida, and to other places in Florida, but they're also setting up a war room now in Washington to deal with it.
Let me talk about Congress for a second, because you cover Congress, and the reaction before today among congressional representatives and senators. I mean, how is this playing out politically?
Politically, there are Democrats worried. Why? Because as we just saw on election night, they gained some numbers in the House and the Senate, but they didn't gain the majorities. They believe that in 2002, they could probably gain those majorities, but they're concerned that there could be a backlash by the American people against the Democratic Party if this draws on too long. Now, the polls have shown that backlash has not yet appeared, that people are willing to wait a short amount of time to see that every vote has been counted. But there are Democratic leaders who have been supportive of Vice President Gore, but in particular, Senator Robert Torricelli expressing concern. And we heard from the First Lady of the United States, Hillary Clinton, saying yesterday that she believes that a president should be chosen by the popular vote, not the Electoral College. So some of them are
not for now.
Right, not for now. So
yeah,
people are staking out ground on this particular issue as well.
Nora O'Donnell, thank you very much. We'll get back to you in a little while. We'll continue to follow this situation. If people from the Gore campaign speak, we'll carry it live. Those people in Palm Beach County, though, they're going to continue to hand count 4 precincts, and then who knows, they might count the whole county before it's over. Bush campaign wants to stop that. We'll be back with more after this.
Can we still drive our cars and have cleaner air? We think so. Today, BP is improving air quality in 50 major cities around the world and across the U.S. by introducing cleaner burning gasoline and diesel fuels. It's not an end to the problem, but the solution has to start somewhere. BP.
Are you ready to see yourself as others see you? I didn't know I was so gray. Now escape that old gray look with new Just for Men. More than a hair color, it's the Rejuvenator. Just for Men shampoos away gray in 5 easy minutes, and now has vitamins. It brings back a thicker, healthier look that's completely natural.
I like what I see.
The Bush campaign seeks a federal injunction. The Gore campaign wants another ballot recount in Florida. All-out confusion this afternoon. There seems to be no end in sight to this story. Let's begin with our correspondents, starting with NBC's Chris Jansing in Tallahassee. Chris, tell us about this lawsuit that the Bush campaign has filed looking for an injunction.
This is it. It's 49 pages long, David, and it outlines what they say is a reason to stop these recounts. And it seems almost unbelievable, but after a week that has been unprecedented in American politics, a decision on who will be our next president, certainly on who will win Florida's 25 electoral votes, is as elusive, if not more elusive than ever. Now, the person who made this announcement, as you well know, is James Baker. He has been heading George W. Bush's recount team. Let's listen to his explanation for why they believe those manual counts should be stopped.
If this new selective recounting process proceeds, the votes in some counties will be counted in a completely different and standardless manner from the votes in the remaining counties. At this point, a changed result would not be the most accurate result. It would simply be the most recent result. Therefore, we ask that there be no further recounts of already recounted ballots.
Now, we have not heard an official response from any of the top members of the recount team on the Gore side, but they have been sending some representatives out here, local officials, lawyers, politicians, to give their side of the story, because there remain so many members of the media here, not only from around the country, but around the world. I talked a little while ago to Robert Ratcliffe. He's a county commissioner. His office is right over there here in Gainesville. And he responded to the Baker comment that a hand recount is less fair and less accurate.
It's ludicrous for him to say that. The fact is that the only way to have an accurate count of who actually won this state is to physically examine the punch card ballots in 26 counties that, for technical problems that could change the results of that vote.
Are you suggesting that this should be a statewide recount then?
And it should be a statewide count in those counties, and there are 26 counties in Florida that use the punch card ballot system. There are technical problems that are inherent with that create spoiled ballots that don't happen in counties with optically scanned ballots.
Here's the problem as James Baker sees it. Each county has the right to decide then, if they do this hand recount, what their standards are, what stays and what goes. For example, he says one electoral board may decide to count votes that are not fully punched, others may not. One electoral board may decide that a stray mark indicated an intent to vote for a particular candidate, another may not. It becomes a very inconsistent series of decisions county by county.
It doesn't have to be that way at all, and it is a false choice that he presents us with. The fact of the matter is there are procedures in other states, in Michigan, in Kentucky, in other municipalities where there are very established and objective ways to evaluate those ballots.
And again, that was Robert Ratcliffe here in Tallahassee, which is Leon County. He is a commissioner here. Now, voters, we're told, are much less likely to have a successful vote for president if they use this punch ballot. Here's the statistics that we got from Mr. Ratcliffe, and he had a nice graphic for us. He says that for every 1,000 ballots cast at the polls, now this is for the state of Florida, optical scanners, 2 of them were not properly cast, so they could not be recorded for president. Lever machines 1, but in punch card ballots, fully 32 out of every 1,000 people who cast ballots were not able to have them recorded for president. Now, make no mistake, because of everything that's going on, there will be a reassessment of the way voting takes place, probably not just in the 4 main counties that are in dispute, but all over Florida and perhaps all over the country. But in the meantime, the bottom line is we have no immediate resolution to this, and it could be some time before we get a final count here in Florida. David?
NBC's Chris Jansing reporting live from Tallahassee, Florida. Thanks so much, Chris. We should remind our viewers, if you're just now joining us, that a federal judge in South Florida, Donald Middlebrooks, has now scheduled a hearing for 9:30 a.m. for Monday morning to hear the Bush request for an injunction to stop as many as 4 Florida counties, heavily Democratic Florida counties, from going ahead with this manual ballot-to-ballot recount, which they're objecting to. Now, Ashley Banfield is covering the Bush campaign for us. She joins us now from Crawford, Texas, near Waco, near the Bush family ranch. Ashley, good afternoon.
Hi there, David. You bet. I'm near the Bush family ranch where not too long ago Governor Bush and Dick Cheney came out for an impromptu news conference, but it was not a public one. It was one of those pool availability, so it was taped with a select few reporters from the pool feed, for the pool feed, and he talked specifically about the reference to what's going on in Florida, but his answer to those questions was, please refer to Secretary Cheney. So it's fairly clear that he wants to sort of divorce himself a little bit from the legal wrangling and instead carry on with what he says is the planning for a new administration, being that it's only about 2 months or so away from the inauguration. But there was something else interesting that he said, David, that I wanted to bounce off of here. He talked a little bit about other states as well that are too close to call. In fact, he referred specifically to New Mexico, which has 5 electoral votes. We were there on the campaign trail. It has just recently been pushed over into the Bush column, and I wanted to play you a tape from the campaign trail from October 30th. I had a chance to catch up with the governor on the trail and ask him why New Mexico, why he'd spend his last few moments there, and here's what it sounded like. How are things going for you this morning?
Well, great. We're here in New Mexico. It's obviously a neighboring state to Texas. It's a state that the president ran the last couple of cycles. I'm going to carry it this time.
5 electoral votes. 5 electoral votes.
Yeah,
Is it worth
we're
it?
also on our way to California, where there's a lot of electoral votes. And the big surprise of this election year is I'm going to carry California.
Turns out those 5 electoral votes could be very important after all. I want to take you inside this coffee station, and I decided to use the DV cam. It's a little less intrusive, and find out what some of the folks in Crawford think about. Thanks very much. Think about what's been going on in Florida and what's happening now inside their very own town. In fact, these women over here were in the parking lot just outside when Governor Bush showed up in Crawford last night. You had a chance, you guys, to see the governor, and I think you actually had a chance to shake his hand?
Yes, I did.
And how was it? What was it like for him coming to Crawford?
It was very, very exciting. We had already met him earlier at graduation, but it was very gracious of him to stop in Crawford again last night before he went to the ranch. My little boy was with me, and he had a hat signed, so he left a real happy young man.
And Sydney, did you decorate the governor's the gates to his ranch?
Yes, I did, along with these two.
Okay, this is my terrible photography, folks. So I want to let you see that I'm playing photographer as well. I just want to ask you quickly something fairly serious, and that is what's going on in Florida. A lot of legal wrangling, and the governor has tried to challenge some of the recounts. He's put an injunction in, and the Gore campaign is also challenging that injunction. What does that make you feel here, sort of in the heart of it, with the governor living only about 7 miles away?
Well, I'm sorry that he's having to go to such extremes to try to get the facts correct, and I think that in this high-tech world we live in, it's kind of unbelievable that this is having to go on, and I think that it's very stressful on the country, and the sooner that it's over, the better.
All right, and how do you feel about this, knowing that you're sort of at the heart of history in the making?
It's very exciting, and I'm honored, like our entire community is.
Yeah. Did you have a chance to see him as well?
I certainly did. In fact, I hosted a party for him Tuesday night, and I just said my name as he drove up, and he came over and kissed me on the cheek and thanked me for the events that we had been hosting, and I was very surprised that he even, knew my name. And that tells you a lot about him right there.
Regardless of how this election turns out, do you think this is basically going to put Crawford, Texas on the map?
I think we are on the map. I think, whether he's our president or our governor, he's always going to be a part of our community, and everybody's going to know who George W. is and where Crawford, Texas is.
So I can obviously tell that you all have the same shirts on saying Republican women for Bush. Have you run across any Democrats in town who feel differently about what's happening in Florida?
I myself have not, but I don't know how you could vote for anybody but George W. He's his own person. You know who he's going to be tomorrow. As far as what personality he's going to have, and I think what you see is what you get with him, and that's what the nation wants.
Thanks very much, David. As you can see, partisan crowd here at the coffee station. This is a very unusual way to do a live shot, but I'm sort of learning the technicalities along the way. Back to you.
Ashley Banfield live in Crawford, Texas. Thanks so much, Ashley. NBC's Diane Diamond has her eye on Al Gore's campaign. She's outside the vice president's residence in Washington, D.C. Diane, what's the next step for the Gore team?
Well, I'll tell you, David, this is some strategy session going on in the vice president's residence behind me. It's been going on for 4 hours now. Warren Christopher and William Daley, the campaign chairman, arrived here very unexpectedly. They'd been waging the battle against the ballots down there in Florida. They got here about 11 a.m. Eastern time this morning, and we have been waiting out here ever since. It's actually getting a little cold, and the campaign took a little care with us, and I don't know if you can see past those folks, but they just brought out a big pot of coffee for everybody. It really is getting cold. I, in fact, have just borrowed a windbreaker from one of the truck guys. Not really a fashion statement, but I'm a little warmer than I was. We don't know exactly what's going on inside the mansion. I mean, let's be honest, but I think it's a safe bet to say they are strategizing about the Gore response to the Bush request today for a court injunction. To try to stop that hand counting of the ballots in Florida. That counting, of course, is already underway. And so since we now know the judge will make the ruling on that court injunction Monday morning at 9:30 a.m. It is conceivable that this counting, the third counting of these very same ballots, I might add, could already be done by the time the judge's ruling is issued. Now, if that happens, that opens up a whole nother can of worms, of course. Let's just say theoretically that this counting happens to go in this time for Al Gore. But then the judge rules in George Bush's favor and says that the ballot should not be counted. Well, they've already been counted. Now, a third time, what happens to that count? Is it simply not certified? Perhaps that would be the remedy. We just don't know. Now, while George W. Bush speaks to the media and therefore the American people every day now, we just heard him speak a short while ago here on MSNBC, it's sort of stunning that Al Gore has said absolutely nothing. Today, none of his major surrogates said anything either. We did see the vice president yesterday out here on the lawn about this very same time, engaging in an impromptu Kennedy clan type touch football game with his family. Of course, what we're waiting for now is a news conference with Warren Christopher or William Daley. We're told that it could happen this afternoon. We think it is likely. We'll get a 45-minute warning on that. You know, the vice president came back here to the mansion from Nashville because we were told he had vice presidential duties to attend to. I'll tell you, David, I'm not sure he's had much time to attend to any of those kind of duties at all.
NBC's Diane Diamond, thanks so much. You mentioned the recount going on in Palm Beach County. As we close here, let's take a look at the recount going on live. There are two Florida counties, actually Palm Beach in South Florida and Volusia County to the north, where this hand recount, ballot by ballot recount is underway despite the objections of the Bush campaign. We'll have more of Decision 2000, the battle for the White House, when we return. Stay with MSNBC. I'm David Bloom. Welcome back to our Decision 2000 Battle for the White House coverage on MSNBC. We're joined by NBC's Nora O'Donnell, who's been trying to do some reporting on the Bush team having filed this injunction, blocking the recount that's going on in Florida right now, and also the likely response from the Gore campaign.
Right. Well, NBC News has learned that this hearing is set for Monday at 9:30, which means effectively that the recounts that they are trying to block that are ongoing today in Miami Beach, in Palm Beach, will go on and will probably be done by Monday. So it sort of begs the question, will this injunction be at all useful if in fact they win? Gore sources are telling me that they do plan to try and file something to argue the other side. They're saying they want the Floridians to have the right to have every one of their votes counted for this recount to continue. But clearly, as we've learned this new information, that the hearing won't be until Monday, it sort of begs this larger question, because it appears that at least in two of the counties, the votes will all be already done.
Well, and that poses not merely a legal question for the Bush campaign, but also a public relations problem, in that, number one, they've been critical of the Gore campaign for threatening to file lawsuits, and yet the first lawsuit that got filed was on behalf of the Bush campaign. And then second of all, there'd be a public relations problem even if the balloting didn't ultimately count. If that result gets revealed and, for example, Gore gets more than the 327 votes that he's now behind by, that would pose a real problem for Governor Bush.
That's an excellent point, and that is the point that Democrats and people within the Gore campaign are making to me today. They say exactly that. Here they feel the Bush campaign was making this case about lawsuits, and then they become the first to file a lawsuit. They believe politically now they have the upper hand, that people will think, especially Floridians will think, it's unfair that they're trying to block a vote when it's only 300 votes. Shouldn't we let this process play itself out? Shouldn't we allow these manual recounts where there are both members of the Bush and Gore teams overseeing this manual recount? So politically, they're very energized within the Gore campaign. They've set up a war room in Washington. They've set up a war room in Florida. They're clearly energized by this. We're waiting to hear from Secretary Daley and former Secretary Daley and Secretary Warren Christopher, who have been inside the House now for almost 4 hours. They were expected to speak to us at 12 o'clock, but clearly plotting not only their own legal strategy, but their political strategy.
And of course, part of the problem for the Gore team has been that they were widely seen to have stumbled the first few days out of the gate by in the eyes of many, even many Democrats, being overly aggressive in terms of what they were threatening to carry out.
Right, exactly. And we know now that this case is going to be heard by a U.S. District Judge Donald Middlebrooks, a Clinton appointee in Miami-Dade, Monday at 9:30. Even though it's a Clinton appointee, he is fairly well respected by many in the community. He got through a Republican Senate confirmation. He's pretty well regarded.
NBC's Nora O'Donnell, thanks so much. Keep us posted.
Thanks.
And for more on the recount debate, we're joined by Republican consultant Niger Innis, who's also the national spokesman for the Congress of Racial Equality. We're also joined by MSNBC analyst Ray Brown. He's an attorney and a professor at Seton Hall Law School. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Let me begin with you and the discussion, Niger, that we were just having about the public relations downside for the Bush campaign. You're a Republican. There have been Democrats who've been highly critical of the Gore campaign for threatening to drag out this process. Now the first lawsuit winds up getting filed not by the Gore campaign, but by the Bush campaign. You acknowledge that that's a potential PR problem, right?
It's a potential problem if people don't realize that there are 8 lawsuits already on the books, already being filed. Granted, not technically by the Gore campaign, but by allies of the Gore campaign, supported by the Gore campaign. Daley himself said that these lawsuits that are being pursued already by the Gore campaign have the support of the Gore campaign.
Professor Ray Brown, there's this hearing on the Bush plea for an injunction, 9:30 Monday morning now. What are we likely to see happen beginning Monday morning in terms of the legal process sorting itself out?
Well, obviously the Bush people are saying this process has to stop. If some of the recount has taken place, they'll say we don't want it certified and we don't want any further recounts. And obviously the Gore people who expect, I think, to mine gold in Palm Beach County are saying, Judge, there's no reason for us to be here. There's nothing that's going to happen bad from this recount. If somebody thinks it's inadequate down the road, a state court can toss it out.
And the question is, of course, David, how many recounts are we going to have?
Well,
we've already had an election,
Bush...
we've already had a count, we've already had a recount, and this is important to realize too, because people keep talking about, the brother's governor, the candidate's brother is governor. The fact of the matter is these things are decided on a local level, and in these local counties, they're controlled by Democrats. These ballots are created, the elections are monitored, both campaigns have their teams of operators there watching the election while it's going on, watching the count, watching the recount. How many of these do we have?
There's an answer to the how many, and the question is it fair to say that actually eyeballing cards which have these Chad controversy attached to them gives you a better answer?
And what we're talking about is in terms of whether or not somebody actually just punched out the ballot correctly.
Right. So the question is, does the human factor make it a more efficient count, or, as the Republicans claim, does it make it less reliable? And that's a judge is going to have to decide whether he should decide that.
That's going to have to be the last word for it. This moment, Ray Brown.
Never again? Nothing else to be said?
Certainly you can come back.
We'll be back here.
Niger Innis, thanks so much. We're back after this on MSNBC's continuing live coverage of Decision 2000, the battle for the White House. I'm David Bloom. Stay with us. Counts until tomorrow morning. In the last few days, we've seen how important it is to have a uniform, modern system for casting and counting ballots. Some people are asking, is the internet the answer? MSNBC Internet correspondent Lisa Napoli reports.
The neck-and-neck presidential election of 1960, when Richard Nixon conceded defeat even after evidence of voter fraud surfaced, sparked ideas in the minds of voting reform advocates. Disillusioned by low voter turnout, ballot confusion, and early inaccurate polls, many trumpeted the idea of voting by what was at the time a high-tech tool, the telephone. The father of broadcasting, RCA chair David Sarnoff, predicted in 1964 that by the 1980s, voting would take place via computers. Even in this age of the internet, where there's a computer on virtually every desktop, voting machines in many parts of the nation are antiquated and confusing. This election day, 1 in 5 Americans who voted used a machine introduced in 1892. In recent years, some locations have experimented with the idea of casting ballots by mail, but even that low-tech form of balloting is not without controversy.
How do we know they're going to get it?
This past March in Arizona, voters went to the polls for the Democratic primary, and thousands of them cast ballots online. It was the first legally binding online election ever. Over the summer, delegates at the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles cast their ballots on a computer for the first time ever in another experiment in online voting.
We're committed to security, and security is very important for online voting. So what we've done is we've provided for a PIN number for each of the delegates.
But how to make online voting safe and secure is a major question for many critics of computerized voting. Fears of hacking or terrorist intervention are a major concern. So are technical glitches inevitable with any machines. Others are concerned about the so-called digital divide and whether online voting would exclude those who don't have computers. Proponents of internet voting, though, say the computer could not only streamline the counting of ballots, but offer a uniform, nationwide blueprint for them.
People were totally confused. People didn't know what they were doing. They were changing their ballots. They were calling over, and they refused to let us tell them that if you want to vote for Al Gore, press 5. They refused.
Avoiding the confusion and chaos stirred up in Palm Beach County and elsewhere this election. Lisa Napoli, NBC News.
The secret strategy and inside stories only one man can tell. Waging war, General Schwarzkopf's diary.
Welcome back. There have been several major developments in the race for the White House today. Let's get you up to speed on the latest. The Bush campaign is seeking a federal court injunction in Florida to stop the hand recounts going on there in so far one Florida county, but potentially as many as 4 Florida counties, arguing that they are less fair and less accurate than machine counts. And NBC News has just learned that U.S. District Judge Donald Middlebrooks will hold a hearing on that Bush plea for an injunction beginning at 9:30 a.m. Monday morning, 9:30 Eastern Time. Dan Abrams is following the legal maze of Decision 2000 for us. He joins us now from Tallahassee, Florida with the latest. Good afternoon, Dan.
Well, hi there, David. What the Republicans have done is they've gone into a federal court and they have said, we want you to, in effect, invalidate a portion of the Florida law. Why go to federal court? Well, the Republicans say there is a violation of the U.S. Constitution, that in effect, by allowing these manual recounts to go forward, individuals who've already voted, votes would be diluted. They say it would also be a violation of equal protection. Here's what James Baker had to say about the effect of this lawsuit.
There are no standards. Yes, it is true. There will be representatives of both campaigns there, but there are no standards to guide the subjective intent of the electoral board, or the canvassing board as you call it here in Florida. And they can divine the intent of the voter. They can say, well, I think the voter meant this, and they don't have to show any basis for that whatsoever, or any evidence for that.
And that is their primary concern here, that there are not enough standards within that statute. Now, it does say in the statute that a member of each party is supposed to be there as part of the counting team, but in the end, it is the canvassing board of that county who makes the final calls on the ballots. For example, if they come in and they say, well, this one's kind of a close call, does it seem like this one was actually a vote for Al Gore? That decision is made by the canvassing board. The Republicans appear concerned that that is going to be a political decision that is made and not an objective one. When it comes to the question of politics, though, David, one question we have to ask is, what political party or what affiliation does the judge have? This federal judge, as you pointed out, 9:30 a.m. on Monday is going to conduct a hearing. Judge Middlebrooks is a Democrat. He was appointed by Clinton in 1997. I shouldn't say he's a Democrat. We don't know how he's voted in these elections. We do know that he was appointed by Clinton in 1997. He's been serving on the bench for 3.5 years, 54 years old, sort of thought of as a guy who is open-minded and will make the tough decisions on his own. But we'll just have to see, and there's no question in this type of case that anytime a judge gets involved, people are going to say, what are that judge's politics? David?
Dan, help me out on one point. As I understand it, one of the arguments the Gore campaign is planning to make is that when this first recount of votes took place, which has Bush leading Gore by some 327 votes, according to the unofficial Associated Press counts, there was a hand recount in Seminole County, which benefited Bush, adding some close to 100 votes for Governor Bush. Doesn't that undercut the validity of their argument against hand counts?
Well, again, we should point out that what they're saying is not just that hand counts are a problem. What they're saying is that the way the statute is set up in Florida, it doesn't provide enough standards, enough requirements, enough objectivity for hand counts to be executed effectively. Now, there is a debate about exactly how that worked in Florida. For example, was someone actually hand counting them in that county, as you point out, or were they simply using their hands to put it into a machine? We're going to have to see what the county has to say about that issue, but I think that may end up being something of a red herring here. David.
This is Dan Abrams reporting for us from Tallahassee, Florida. Dan, thank you. The situation in Florida continues to make history with the vote recount and lawsuits filed by several Florida residents who claim they were misled into voting for the wrong candidate. You're looking right now at a live picture of the recount, the ballot-by-ballot recount underway in Palm Beach County, despite the objections of the Bush campaign. And joining us now is Florida elections expert John Shubin. John, we now know that this federal judge will hold a hearing at 9:30 a.m. on Monday morning. What should we expect to have happen there?
I think you should expect him to hear arguments from both sides, from the elections of supervisors. There may be some third parties that attempt to intervene in the interim. He will consider them, and he will then make a decision sometime after that. I doubt he will rule from the bench.
But just help those of us who don't follow election law very closely understand this. As I understand it, judges, be they a state judge in Florida or a federal judge, are very reluctant to intervene in an election, especially after the fact. Is that right or not?
They're very reluctant to intervene, and particularly federal court judges are very reluctant to intervene when it comes to electoral matters because they're peculiarly within the state court province.
So that being the case, why would the Bush people go to federal court as compared to going to state court to seek their injunction?
They think that they have a right to be in state court because certain First Amendment...
You mean in federal court?
In federal court, excuse me, because certain First Amendment and 14th Amendment rights are being undermined, which give them a potential basis for jurisdiction.
So, as our Florida elections expert, and I mean, it's difficult to handicap these things, but do you give the Bush campaign a better than even chance of being able to stop this hand recount from taking place?
I hate to handicap, but
sure.
I'd probably give them less than a 50% chance on this one. There's some interesting issues, they're novel issues, but traditionally, federal courts do not like to get involved in state court matters. Election law is typically a state court matter.
Florida election expert John Shubin, thanks so much.
Thanks, David.
I'm sure we'll keep coming back to you. When we come back, we'll take a look at some other news that's going on, despite the fact that an American president has not been chosen 4 days after Tuesday's election. There is other news. We'll have that for you when we return to our continuing live coverage. You're watching MSNBC. Stay with us.
The Gore campaign that I'm hearing from today is that they are optimistic that politically they have the upper hand here. That most people, as this poll suggests, people want that for the time to run out. They want to make sure it's fair. They're willing to wait a while, as frustrating as it may be. The Gore campaign also believing that perhaps the Bush campaign has taken the wrong step here in terms of legally and politically, that they are taking a lawsuit.
Nora, let me interrupt you because we're going to go now to Washington, D.C., where we're going to hear from the representatives of the Gore campaign.
Afternoon. Throughout this process, we've proceeded on a single fundamental principle. We want the votes, all the votes cast, to be accurately and fairly counted. The will of the people expressed in accordance with our Constitution should decide who our next president will be. Today, the Bush campaign suddenly filed a motion in federal court to stop the hand counting of ballots in counties in Florida where serious problems with ballots had been identified. Officials in these 3 counties had decided the problems were sufficiently serious to warrant the hand count authorized under Florida law. Let us understand why Florida law calls for a hand count in situations like this. When doubts have arisen, the hand count is seen as the best way to ascertain the true views of the voters. This is common procedure around the nation. Machines can sometimes misread or fail to detect the way ballots are punched, particularly if there is a design flaw in the ballots themselves. In fact, the state of Texas recently enacted a law signed by Governor Bush providing for a hand count as the best way to reach an accurate result in certain disputed situations. If Governor Bush truly believes that he has won the election in Florida, he should not have any reason to doubt or to fear to have the machine count checked by a hand count. This procedure is authorized under Florida law, under Texas law, and under the law of many other jurisdictions. The hand count in these 3 counties, 4 counties that we've asked for as well, can be completed expeditiously, and it should be. Until today, the Bush campaign has argued that every minute counts. We have consistently maintained, however, that as we continue to do today, that every vote must count. A little windy here. We call upon the Bush campaign to withdraw the litigation they have filed today and to allow a full and accurate count to be made of all the votes in the state of Florida. Thank you very much.
Several Democratic members of Congress, party chairmen around the country, have begun expressing concerns about any sort of protracted, bitter process here that would damage the party and potentially the country as well. Can you respond to their concerns?
Well, I think all Americans have a desire to see this finished expeditiously. One of the reasons why Secretary Christopher just gave his statement regarding this litigation is that may have the opportunity to slow this down. The hand count's proceeding. We want it done expeditiously. We want this brought to conclusion, as all Americans do. And I've talked with a number of Democratic leaders. They have no more of the normal concern that everyone else has. And so I think some of the comments made in the media today, or expectation that there's great concern, are not unfounded in my conversations with a number of Democratic leaders around the nation.
Why should we believe that this hand count is anything more than a fishing expedition? Do you have evidence that there was something to find there? Or is it's heavily Democratic jurisdictions where you expect to get votes?
The only 4 counties in which hand counts were requested were counties where there was real anomalies that showed up, real irregularities. The citizens of those counties felt that the machine count did not accurately reflect the views. We didn't go into every county in Florida. Only 4 counties was there a hand count asked for, and each one of them there was a serious anomaly.
And let me remind you, there is a election committee in each one of those counties who makes a determination, number one, as they move through a sample of precincts, whether there's enough evidence to indicate anomalies to go to the next step, to a full county sample, or full county count.
Republicans now missed the deadline for doing hand counts themselves? Is it?
Well, that's a question of law under Florida law. We'd understood that the deadline has passed, and that's why we were urged the people in the counties to file their requests when they did.
Which raises the question, if you end up winning because of this, haven't you won on a legal technicality?
You won because you had more votes than the other guy.
Well, they didn't get a chance to go to the Republican counties and see if they could find the same thing.
Everybody had a chance. The law is the law. There's a certain period after every election, not just this election, but every election under Florida law, where people have a right to go in if they believe there's discrepancies or anomalies and petition such a thing. This isn't something that just developed or was found as some secret piece of the legislation in Florida.
If for some reason you don't get a full manual recount, will you be willing to accept the tally that comes out on Friday with all the absentee ballots and everything coming in?
Well, there are a number of different processes underway. As you know, there will be the absentee ballots from overseas coming in. They're continuing to count in some of the counties, and there will be these counts coming forward. Now, there will be a hearing by the judge on Monday, and we fully expect that the request of the Bush administration, or the Governor Bush, we fully expect that to be not accepted by the court. But that has to be determined by next Monday. We have real confidence in our position. Our litigators in Florida do not believe that there's an adequate reason to reject the hand count that was authorized by the election commissioners in the 3 counties.
But if that happens, how far are you willing to go legally?
Well, we've been considering various other options. No decision has been reached on that. We're here today to say that we're still interested, as we always have been, in a hand count. We haven't taken any other, and a full count and a fair count. We haven't taken any other decisions at this point.
Bill, are you willing to proceed with recounts in a few of these other states that are very close?
That's up to the voters and citizens of those states to make a judgment, not on political grounds, but on legal grounds that they believe there's a reason for a recount. It's up to them, the citizens. Someone doesn't make a judgment whether to participate in a process that's begun under the law.
Even when the Florida count is done, will you accept that as the end and win one way or the other?
As I said, we have various options under consideration. We haven't made a decision with respect to any of those. We're proceeding in these three areas at the present time, and we'll reach a decision on the others as time moves on.
What's a reasonable amount of time for the country to go without having a conclusive election here?
Well, you know, we're only 3 or 4 days away from the election now. We're proceeding rapidly. We think this hand count can be done expeditiously. I think that, you know, the framers wisely decided to provide an interregnum between the decisions of the voters and the time when the new administration would take over. We've used only a very early part of that decision. Up to now, I would say the importance of getting it right outweighs the importance of rushing to judgment. When that balance will tip, I think none of us are able to say at the present time, but we're certainly at a very early stage in the process, and we certainly have not gone too far at the present time.
Yeah. The afternoon with the Vice President, can you give us any sense of what his mood is, what his thinking is, what his priorities are at this point?
Well, we spent the time both with the Vice President and with Senator Lieberman, who joined us. I believe Senator Lieberman walked over because this is still within his Sabbath day. We discussed at some length this rather surprising action taken by Governor Bush's group under Jim Baker's direction in Florida. We had a good deal of discussion about getting lawyers to represent us in those proceedings so we would be able to make our positions well known. We discussed other aspects of the ongoing process. So what we really did today was Secretary Chairman Daley and I brought the Vice President and then Senator Lieberman, when he could join us, up to date on all that's going on in Florida. As you know, we've got a number of different things going on in Florida at the present time, and we haven't been face-to-face with them for about a week, and we wanted to get back in touch.
Yeah.
Is the Democratic Party actively helping individuals who filed suit in support of Gore?
In actively helping people file suits in Florida? Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. My understanding is 5 suits have been filed in Florida, but I have no knowledge of who the people were or anything. I think they were just citizens, from what I've read in the paper, just citizens of Florida. I haven't heard that.
There's been no contact between the Democratic Party and the people who filed these lawsuits?
The local Democratic parties in Florida?
Or national?
I can't answer equivocally that no one who's a Democrat has talked to someone who may have filed a suit. I don't know the answer to that.
And I have another question.
But we haven't.
What have you guys sat down and said, this is the end game, we'll take it to this point, beyond this period of time, beyond this legal battle, we'll go no further? Do you have in your minds how far you'll go?
I think Secretary Christopher has clearly answered that question as far as what we dealt with today and what we're dealing on a day-to-day basis. And as you know, this is moving and changing rather rapidly. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, can you tell us a little bit about the new committee that's being formed, the $3 million, how exactly that functions? Where?
My understanding is it's a recount committee that is required basically of candidates, federal candidates, congressmen, senators. This is a normal procedure when there's a dispute after an election because your campaign committee and the presidential cannot use money to pay for such activities during that recount. So you establish one of these committees, and it's all required or set up by law.
And are you also the chairman of that? And will the money raised be reported?
I assume it will be reported. Yeah, I assume it is disclosed under the laws. I'm pretty sure it is, but I don't know the exact details of it. We'll have someone give them to you.
Has there been any discussion at all in recent days about transition matters that are still ongoing at some level?
The Vice President, as we've stated repeatedly, has been prepared to transition in an emergency basis, obviously, for 8 years into the presidency. This is only 4 days since the election. Work had been done prior to the election on a transition. and that will be dealt with, I assume, shortly. But the Vice President and his team are well prepared, as they have been for 8 years, in case an emergency happens.
If the absentee ballots come back in on Friday and it clearly shows that Governor Bush has won Florida, will the Vice President concede the state and the election?
We've had a number of different forms of that question, haven't we? Yeah. And I'll answer it in the same way by saying, we're proceeding down these tracks. We've considered other options. No decision has been made on them, and we'll certainly let you know when they have been.
So the answer is you will not concede Florida if it clearly shows the absentee ballots show that Governor Bush carried the state of Florida?
That decision has not been made at the present time. As we've mentioned before, there are other options that we have before us, and we're going to hold on to those options for the present time.
And we strongly believe that at the end of this process, Al Gore will be the winner of the Florida vote.
Mr. Daly, can you briefly address the subject matter that Mr. Baker brought up this morning, that the manual count is less accurate, less fair, and does have to weigh the intent of the voters, and therefore it can be manipulated? Can you talk about that?
Under Florida law, this is allowed, and it is done, I assume, more often than in this occasion. And the electors in an open, the commission members of these in an open process with both parties being represented at the same time are there. If there is a dispute, it has to be worked out between the parties at the table. I don't think one should assume that in all occasions a machine is more guaranteed to give you the right result than humans. I don't think that's the occasion.
What about the interpretation of the ballot? Did the person intend to mark this mark or the other mark?
I think they base that upon evidence that's there. They don't just make that up. It's the judgment that they make based on evidence.
Thank you.
Coming here tonight, sir?
He's here.
There you have it, the latest from Bill Daley and Warren Christopher of the Gore campaign. I know some American TV viewers may be watching football on this autumn Saturday afternoon, but they are missing the hour-by-hour, day-by-day verbal combat, an example of which we've just seen there. Now, a couple of things out of that I noticed. First of all, a bit of a surprise, no counter-legal threat to try to stop the Bush's effort to have an injunction against the hand count that's going on right now in Florida. Instead, Warren Christopher called upon the Bush campaign to withdraw the attempt to have an injunction to stop the hand count. Christopher went on to say that if George W. Bush truly believes he won Florida, he should have no fear, said Warren Christopher, of a hand recount. Interesting challenge there to the George W. Bush organization from Warren Christopher. A couple of other points. Florida law, Christopher said, calls for a hand count. He said the best way to ascertain the true views of the voter is a hand count. And he said that especially in cases where a machine is being used, a machine is very, very good, but not necessarily when a ballot has flaws, as the Gore organization contends was the case with the Florida ballot. So that's basically the latest in a nutshell from Warren Christopher and William Daley, if you've just tuned in. Nora O'Donnell here with us. She's been watching. What did you notice?
A couple of things as well. The two of them mentioning that Senator Lieberman walked over to the Vice President's mansion, is heavily involved with the negotiations. Over the week, I've heard that he's been calling congressmen and officials down in Florida to brief them, to talk to them, to find out things. Warren Christopher also saying that they are talking about getting lawyers to represent them to make their position well known at this hearing on Monday. They are calling on them to withdraw the litigation, not announcing any countersuit, but they clearly are going to make their positions well known at this hearing on Monday. The other thing that I noticed, too, they brought up what Democrats in the Gore campaign are telling us today. Oh, what about this manual hand count? Bush says that that's not as fair or as error-ridden as perhaps a mechanical. Well, Bush signed a law in Texas that in fact calls for a manual recount. That's something coming out of them, and we heard Warren Christopher repeat that as well. One other thing that was brought up that's particularly important today, we've been talking about these manual recounts that are going on in Palm Beach County, in Miami County, in Volusia County, all of those where they're very heavily Democratic, could benefit Gore. Are there other counties where there were anomalies that could benefit Bush? Yes, absolutely. There was a front-page story on the Jacksonville Times-Union about Duval County, where 26,000 votes were thrown out. That is a heavily Republican county, but a deadline has passed. 72 hours, which would not allow the Bush team to ask for a manual recount in a heavily Republican area like Duval County, which today we got reports of where there were anomalies there. And they were pointing that out in this news conference.
And that came up in this little news conference, and it certainly wasn't sad news for the Gore people, that particular point.
It appears that they had their sort of ducks in a row, if you will, their legal ducks in a row, and
they
we're well prepared for this. Yeah.
Laura, we're going to bring Diane Diamond in just a second. She is outside the Gore residence. But one other interesting thing, it is true that while the Gore people are saying they're not going to mount this counter-legal challenge right away, they are lining up some high-powered legal talent. NBC's Pete Williams is reporting to us that sources tell him Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe, an internationally renowned constitutional scholar, has been retained by the Gore campaign to argue its case Monday when the hearing takes place in Florida. Lawrence Tribe, a well thought of and well renowned person there. Now, Diane Diamond, quickly, from the Gore residence, we heard it, you heard it. What's the latest down there?
Hi, Bob. How are you? Well, I tell you, I was kind of struck by that's all we got. I mean, we've been here about 5 hours today waiting for Warren Christopher and William Daley to come out and tell us their big strategy plan. What they really did was come out and sort of repeat what they've been saying. They think hand counting is the only way to go. They think that every vote should be counted free and fairly. We heard a lot of the same thing. It's what you said. It's what Warren Christopher didn't say that was important. There will be no legal challenge, at least not for now. He was asked several different ways this question. If after the absentee ballots are counted then and certified by the state of Florida, then will you accept it? And he never said yes. He said, we continue to keep all our options open. We have many options to us. They will remain open. I want to give you one thing that Warren Christopher said about George W. Bush. Listen to this.
Diane, we don't really have time to do that, but give us a quick wrap-up. What was he going to say?
He said if George Bush is so confident that he wins Florida, well, then why can't we go ahead with this recount?
And I think, Diane, thank you very much. That is the major challenge that was issued there as this combat, as we're calling it, verbal combat continues. Stay with us. More continuing coverage on MSNBC.
We call upon the Bush campaign to withdraw the litigation they have filed today and to allow a full and accurate count to be made of all the votes in the state of Florida. We have real confidence in our position. Our litigators in Florida do not believe that there's an adequate reason to reject the hand count.
The manual vote count sought by the Gore campaign would not be more accurate than an automated count. Indeed, it would be less fair and less accurate.
Their representatives speak, but Governor Bush and Vice President Gore may be crossing their fingers today while Florida election workers begin to let their fingers do the counting. It's day 4 of what you could call the crisis of the count. America waits in agonizing suspense. Hi there, everybody. Bob Kerr back with you here on MSNBC. Just what do the American people think about what's been happening with this election? After all, a lot of people say it'll come down to public opinion in the end. They'll decide when to pull the plug on it. In a Newsweek magazine poll just out tonight, people were asked what should happen in the next step of this political drama. Now let's look at this. When asked how the Florida recount should be resolved, 25% say resolve it as soon as possible, and 72% say the count was fair and accurate. Should the candidates accept the Florida results as final? Well, 17% say not until after the state-mandated recount. 44% say after the overseas absentee ballots are counted. And 36% say after the legal issues are resolved. And then Newsweek asked what should happen in Palm Beach County, Florida, where all those irregularities may have taken place. 48% say the entire county should vote again, and 46% say the situation is not serious enough for a revote. The poll has a 4% margin of error. Suzanne Malveaux is at ground zero. Palm Beach, the historic place today where the vote count is taking place by hand. Suzanne, a big challenge today from the Gore campaign to the Bush organization, which is to say, hey, if you really think you won, you should have nothing to be afraid of with this hand count. Is that a valid challenge?
Well, you know, despite whether or not it is a valid challenge, what is happening here, they say, is going to continue throughout the night. They are not stopping until a federal court judge says, look, this is not fair. We're going to put this off. We're going to go ahead and file and grant that injunction. As long as that hasn't happened yet, this will continue throughout the night. And I have to tell you, Bob, it has been 4 hours now that they have been really, you could look at it as a fishbowl, because we've all been looking at them all day. 4 hours into this, they're going to go well past midnight. They're getting a little wary, and they've actually been allowed to take a break so they can use the restroom or get a bite to eat. We've asked if they're going to order pizza and bring it in. It's much like perhaps sitting on a jury. But these citizens have been actually hand counting, going through those ballots, and they represent 10 Republicans, 8 Democrats, and 5 folks who say they are nonpartisan. They are divided into 6 teams, and there's a Democratic as well as Republican observer who actually look to see what pile are they putting those ballots in. They can determine if it's a Gore pile, if it's a Bush pile. There's another pile for those that have no votes, and further another pile that has double votes, and then finally the questionable pile. What does it mean? Those are the ones that the canvassing board is actually going to take a second look after they go through all of the ballots of the 4 precincts in this particular county. So it is a long and arduous job. They have been at it for now 4 hours, and these really are judgment calls. It is not surprising that this is a controversial process because they have to determine what the voters' intent was, and that is not necessarily obvious at first glance. Bob?
Anybody wearing glasses there at that table, and you really get, oh, there's somebody. There's a bit of comfort. But it must be a very hard job. What are the rules you're operating under there? Are you allowed to speak with these people? And if so, what are they telling you?
You know, we just asked that actually because we were trying to determine if we could talk to people afterwards, and it's not like they aren't allowed to talk to us, although they are not really milling around the rest of us. It's not like they're sequestered. They're back in a room behind here where they're able to take their breaks. But I will tell you, I'll give you a little bit of insight what is happening in the room because we have a pool reporter who's allowed. There's one reporter among all of us who's allowed to observe this, take notes. There's also a video camera, as you know, that's been rolling since this first started. I want to give you a sense of what happened earlier today. Some of the notes from the pool reporter. The canvassing board chairman, Charles Burton, he's the judge in this case, really was a little annoyed by some of the observers early on. He says, don't tell her what pile to put it in, please. This is in quotes. To one of the observers, and the observer says, well, tell me how it's going to work. There was a little bit of frustration, and they started to raise their hands, each one of them, if the observer thought, hey, I don't think this should be in this pile, I think it should be in that pile. He goes on to say, here, another Democratic observer who raised his hand and addressed the judge and said, you know, I'm having the same problem. 6 or 7 ballots here, I think, have dimples on them. He's referring to the little indentation on the ballot, thinking, hey, this is a vote, this is not a non-vote. And then Burton, out of frustration, says, quote, do you want to start all over? We can stop. We can't keep stopping if you all raise your hands. This will never work. So you can see there's some back and forth there, a little bit of frustration inside early on when this first started. I think they've gotten into a groove here. They're on a break now, but this is going to be a very long process. Bob?
Well, they seem to be under a lot of pressure, but they look remarkably relaxed. That's one notable thing about it, even jovial at times. It's pretty interesting. Thanks, and we'll check in with you later. Thanks, Suzanne. Well, it all comes down to those little things they're holding up, the ballots, and it really all comes down to the types of voting machines and ballots that are used around the country to tally these elections. We're going to talk now with somebody who is an expert on all of this. His name is Todd Urosevich, and he's with Election Systems and Software Incorporated. They make different types of voting machines. He's here to show us how they all work. Todd, welcome.
Thank you, Bob.
Give us a little bit of the history of this, if it works into your scenario there with some of the machines. What is the history of voting in this country? What have we used? When did we start using it?
Well, we've set up the 4 different types of voting equipment that are currently used in the U.S. today, and we've done that in a chronological order for you. This is a voting demonstration model of the mechanical lever machines that were introduced into the United States actually in 1892. By 1960, over 50% of the electorate was voting on the mechanical voting devices. The punch card system, which many of the viewers have been seeing all day, was introduced in 1960, and by the mid-70s, over half the electorate was voting on the punch card system.
Todd, let me ask you a quick question. On that machine that looks rather simple, did it have its share of problems? The first one you showed us. Yeah, go on back to it.
The mechanical voting machine.
Yeah.
The mechanical voting machine, all of these systems do have pros and cons. I guess the biggest drawback of a mechanical voting device is there's really no audit trail, for example, for a recount to be conducted on, such as going on in Florida today. But by and large, they served many counties across the United States for many, many years and continue to do so today.
Okay, let's move on. Let's update ourselves and go to your next one.
In the middle 70s, optical mark reading equipment were introduced, and basically the concept of the optical mark reading equipment is for the voter to, with a marking device, fill in the vote for the candidate of their choice. And then there are two types of scanning equipment, the kind that you insert the ballot at a polling place where the ballot is counted automatically, or a central tabulation device where the ballots are brought in after the polls are closed at the end of the day and a machine does the tabulation.
Well, that looks pretty state-of-the-art, but is that the state-of-the-art?
Well, actually, probably not. Most would consider the DRE, or the direct recording equipment, state-of-the-art today. The DRE is a process whereby an electronic ballot is presented to the voter. There's two types of DREs. One is referred to as a paging system, which you're looking at now, and the other to my right is a full-face DRE, which presents the entire ballot to the voter at a glance. So these are the latest technological advancements in the election industry, the DREs that you see behind me.
Todd, given all you've shown us, have you watched those live pictures today of those folks down in Palm Beach County looking at those little holes?
I've seen a little bit of it, and it looks quite familiar, actually.
Well, what do you make of it? I mean, that's the key to this whole controversy, apparently.
Well, the punch card systems and the optical mark reading systems, by and large, on a tight race, typically the punch cards or the optical mark reading ballots are typically manually tabulated. So I guess from our perspective, this isn't totally unusual, although obviously the circumstances are quite unusual.
Well, you know, much has been said this week about the age of the, the scanner in the supermarkets and the ATM machines. Why are we still voting the way we're voting?
Well, historically in the United States, the election industry has always been an industry the last to take advantage of technology, and that's for a number of reasons. Government with money to spend on roads and bridges versus voting equipment. Difficult choices have to be made, and to an extent you are limited to technological advances in voting, because you have to ensure that all people are able to participate, and you're not disenfranchising any of the electorate by introducing a technology that some may be intimidated by or not quite, frankly, not quite understand.
Todd, some people are beginning to raise the specter of internet voting. Sounds a little odd to me or iffy to me. What about you?
Well, I think vendors in our industry, of course, have no say into that, but we are certainly preparing for that day, and I think it's a matter of when, not if. I think it's a ways off, but it will be much like the absentee system is a subsystem of the voting process. I think that's the way we're looking at internet voting, that it will be a portion of the people will be voting on the internet, not the entire public.
Todd, if you will, wander back over to the punch card, and we'll, certainly, since that's the key to everything in the past few days and possibly the next however many days, let us see you do that, demonstrate that for us as we go out on this segment, and explain a little bit more about that.
Well, the punch cards were obviously originally used to program computers, and now today this is the only use of the punch card in the world. The punch card is inserted into this type of punching apparatus is referred to as a vote-o-matic. It's one of probably 3 or 4 types used in America. And then with this stylus, the voter simply punches the hole for the candidate of their choice, goes down to the next race, does the same, and then would flip a page in the vote-o-matic